When I say Gothic, what do you think? What do you see? Is it that? Or maybe that? Maybe that? Even that? The term seems to conjure up certain associations, for sure, certain images, but why? What does a cathedral have to do with Edgar Allan Poe? What does a graveyard have to do with a nose ring and black eyeliner? So a little context first about where the term Gothic comes from. The name Gothic started with the Germanic tribes called the Goths that sacked Rome and ushered in the Middle Ages. Goth or Gothic came to be synonymous with barbaric, benighted, uncivilized, savage. When a new style of architecture sprouted around the 12th century, featuring pointed arches and ribbed vaults, flying buttresses and narrow spires, later Renaissance critics erroneously believed that this architecture was created by the Germanic tribes and regarded it as ugly and barbaric, so they called the architecture Gothic, intending it as a slight, and the name stuck. And then some innovative writers in the mid-18th century set their suspenseful tales of febrile maidens fleeing supernatural forces in these dilapidated, shadowy Gothic structures, and poof, a genre was born. That's the etymology. That's how a term denoting barbarians came to denote style of literature. But the key for us today is this guy. It is not an oversimplification to say that the literary world is never really the same. Post-Freud, the melodramatic hallmarks of Gothic lit morph into metaphor and are driven inward. The human condition itself becomes Gothic. Dark and spooky outer landscapes come to mirror the murky inner terrain of the self. Haunted houses are tortured minds. Locked doors stand in for repressed memories. Ghosts and specters represent the Jekyllian parts of ourselves clamoring to get out. We are not who we thought we were. The seemingly self-contained, cohesive, outer human body turns out to house a confused and contradictory jumble of needs and fears and desires, few of them reconcilable. We love our mother. We hate our mother. We are all houses of cards, forever threatening to buckle when our skeletons kick the table. Our defense against this is repression. We hide, we bury, and mask what we don't want others to see and don't want to see ourselves. As the saying goes, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. Meaning nothing could be more human than repression. We don't want to think about ourselves in the light of absolute reality. Without our armor on, the populace will see us for what we know at heart we are, or fear we might really be, charlatans and scammers, forever afraid that we will be disrobed and seen in our true proportions, and they are remarkably humble, maybe even grotesque. In Gothic land, though, repression never stays repressed for long. It always resurfaces, and it's rarely pretty when it does. The robe always comes off, the body never stays buried, the repressed always returns. Like any encompassing term, though, Gothic is a set of Venn diagrams more than it is a checklist of must-haves. Some elements or set pieces do predominate, though, and one of those is mood, or atmosphere. Part and parcel of that mood of dread is the notion of haunting. A house, a town, a dark woods, a human being, a self-contained terrain needs to be infringed upon by a disruptive force. And that force is 99.9% of the time something from the past that was previously unknown or unacknowledged, a trauma, a secret, a truth soaked in the hushed tones of taboo and shut away, destined to calamitously return. What is a ghost other than the buried past, disinterred, the forgotten saying, not so fast? The Gothic scholar Eric Savoy puts it this way: the defining characteristic of Gothic lit is something hidden that recurs. Pre-Freud, this would be a body that gets buried and comes back, a la The Walking Dead. But these days, what's hidden is more likely to resemble psychological whack-a-mole, where the whack is our attempt at repression and the mole is whatever it is we want to repress. But the key in terms of a Gothic sensibility is that you never win the game. Repression never works, not in the long run. The mole will always eventually return, fundamentally unwhackable. Take the recent horror movie, The Babadook. There's a mother who, on the way to the hospital to give birth to her son, gets into a car accident where her husband is killed, but the baby to come survives. Her son's birthday is now the anniversary of her husband's death. She loves her son, but he's also a symbol of all that she's lost. 6 years pass. The colors of the film are washed out. The plants and trees around her house are dead or barren. The door to the basement where her husband's things are is locked. She sleepwalks through her days, stagnant, outwardly alive, but clearly dead inside. Except she's not. There is a leviathan of grief that hasn't been processed laying within her. It's not a stretch at all to say she's haunted by the past, except that we're talking about memory here, not monsters. Except one day a spooky book arrives, and of course she reads it, and in so doing, an entity takes up residence inside her home and even rides its way into her body. She becomes rageful, terrifying, and fantasidal, possessed. And yes, there's a monster now, because there's this supernatural presence in her. But what is this monster? Well, it's her grief. A grief that's been lying dormant and is now awoken. The return of the repressed. And the only way to exorcise the demon is to come to terms with it. Acknowledge that it exists. Only then can you move on and rid it from the home of the self. And she kind of does that. And the roses in her yard start blooming. The end. But it isn't just houses themselves that are haunted. It's narrative itself. History, with a capital H, is haunted. It's a palimpsest. Underneath every uppermost word lies 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000 others, erased but never fully gone. Always traces peek through, reminders of what isn't there. An absence, a gap, made manifest. There is the accepted, sanitized, coherent national narrative, but it's like a skin product whose packaging promises purity, and you open it to find buried in that ointment a fly. For every Western expansion, a Native American genocide. For every we hold these truths to be self-evident, chattel. For every glossy eagle, Stonewall. So what's true? And what's jingoism? The great African-American writer Audre Lorde tells us in her awesome essay, The 4th of July, of her walking around Washington, D.C. in the late 1940s, squinting up at all the lofty monuments to democracy and freedom and equality, barely able to see them because of the bright sunny day. To get some relief, she goes with her family to an ice cream shop, and she can finally see. And what does she see? The waitress telling her the shop doesn't serve their kind. They'll have to leave. This dance of narrative and counter-narrative both lay claim to the truth, but in their opposition, obliterate it. They cannot be reconciled because both fight to lead. And it's here the Gothic can really teach us something about the world, and especially about our current political situation. We talk about our country as one that's divided, which is really another way of saying we have competing narratives in play, each vying for superiority and claiming to be real, authoritative. One man's progressivism is another's snobby elitism. A person touts traditional values while another calls it plain old patriarchy. The modern liberal humanist believes that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. The road is perilous, yes. The road is beset by obstacles, but it is getting paved, inch by inch. Those trying to conserve their privilege are backwards, closed-minded, bigoted, they say. But we can see these characterizations as rhetorical acts of repression, a concerted effort to quiet, to delegitimize the counter-narrative and make clarion and unassailable a particular point of view. Trump's rising popularity and eventual electoral win was inconceivable to the secular left, but it doesn't seem so terribly strange when we see it as the return of what the left thought was mostly dormant, or at least culturally surmounted. Or take the would-be election of Hillary Clinton. The glass ceiling seemed in sight. Women's empowerment would reach a crucial milestone, the presidency, a symbolic inflection point, surely, but an important historical achievement nonetheless. But stalking this narrative was a sniggering backlash against the blurring of traditional notions of gender. The counter-narrative insisted men are powerful, and women, well, they are accessories of that power. Or take Black Lives Matter. The deity of personal responsibility professes that your socioeconomic circumstances don't define you, your choices do. Work hard, do right, behave, you'll get there. Black Lives Matter asks, what happens when there is haunted by hundreds of years of segregation, degradation, incarceration, and violence? Black Lives Matter pokes holes in the smooth underbelly of land of the free, home of the brave. If we think of racism and sexism and xenophobia as the left's monster, what the left is trying to repress, a Gothic perspective shows us it's foolhardy to think you'll ever fully vanquish it. Just like at the end of so many horror movies, the monster lies motionless, seemingly overcome, and right before the screen goes black, the monster's eyes flicker open. It's never snuffed out, just smoldering, forever threatening to catch. So while it's tempting to think of history as something that's moving towards some future version of itself, where its tensions are reconciled, the warring factions and restive camps détented, the Gothic mindset urges caution here. There's historical movement, all right, but it's a cycle of repression and return rather than progress strictly defined. The past and its attendant ugliness is never vanquished. It's merely delayed, driven underground where it sits like a word on the tip of the tongue. But just wait, it'll come back soon enough. So how do we get to the roses? A la the Babadook. I really don't know. To my mind, it has to start with understanding that words like true and real and actual are haunted terms, rhetorical more than they are metaphysical, always and forever stalked by shifting, historically contingent reference. They are far from meaningless or relative, for power is the power to define, but they are not free from inclusion and exclusion. Every narrative has a monster it abhors. Maybe, instead of trying to slay it, we can teach it to dance. Thank you.